First across the Scottish borders with clear skies, heavy rain and stronger winds will arrive later on in the night. A band of heavy rain and brisk winds will sweep across Northern Ireland this evening. Rain will be heavy and persistent for a few hours with a lot of spray on the roads. Bands of rain will continue to move north tonight, bringing strong winds for some. It'll turn drier in the south. And that is how the weather is shaping up overnight into tomorrow morning.
We are GB News.
And we'd like to say thank you
to each and every one of you
for helping our great nation
find its voice.
We're absolutely everywhere.
Across England, Scotland,
Wales and Northern Ireland. On TV,
on radio and online.
We're proud to be
the People's Channel,
Britain's
news channel.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christys. I'm not here to mess around. With all the biggest topics and guests, you will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness, brilliant.
And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Hello, I'm Ray Addison in the GB Newsroom. The Chancellor has met the Prime Minister at Chequers to discuss plans to fix the economy. Jeremy Hunt is overhauling his predecessor's mini-budget after saying it went too far too fast. He warns the country faces a difficult period, with tax cuts not coming as quickly as people want, and spending could be squeezed to help balance the books. Shadow Business Secretary Jonathan Reynolds is calling for a general election.
It's not about a change of Chancellor. Look, they can't simply reverse what they've done through something as straightforward as that. They can't simply get round the fact that the Bank of England and the government have been in completely different places for the last month. They've got to recognise what they have done requires the chance for a real fresh start, and that will require a general election.
Just Stop Oil protesters have vandalised an Aston Martin showroom in central London. Demonstrators sat on Park Lane, some gluing themselves to the road, while another activist sprayed orange paint over the luxury carmaker's building. The group is demanding the government halts all new oil and gas licences. Meanwhile, Extinction Rebellion is also staging a demonstration, marching in Parliament Square. It comes as the Home Secretary announces plans to crack down on protests that cause serious disruption and threaten public safety. Suella Braverman says police will be given new powers to take a more proactive approach, specifically targeting tactics used by some climate activists. The government is pushing ahead with a law to keep Britain moving during transport strikes. Legislation will be introduced to ensure minimum service levels are maintained during a walkout. Unions criticise the move, which they say will be unworkable. The measures are expected to come into force next year. Travel expert Simon Calder told us there are practical problems that need to be worked out.
If you say, right, we're going to run 40% of trains, who decides which ones those are and who decides who's allowed to go on them? Because they're all going to fill up. So there's lots of problems associated with it. And as you were saying, it's not going to come until next year anyway, if it gets through a very divided Parliament. And it will be interesting to see how it does work and whether you can actually do this.
Looking abroad, and Iran says 4 inmates have been killed and 61 injured in a fire at Tehran's Evin prison. The jail is notorious for holding political prisoners. The blaze comes amid ongoing unrest in the country following the death of Mahsa Amini. The 22-year-old died in custody after violating the country's strict dress code for women. Security officials say calm has now been restored at the facility. And back home, more than 1,000 Paddington bears, left as a tribute to the late Queen, have found a new home. An image of the Queen consort has been released to mark their donation to children's charity Barnardo's. The toys were left at Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle by mourners in the days following Queen Elizabeth's death. On TV, online and on DAB+ radio, I'll be back. This is GB News.
Good morning again and welcome to Portillo. The last 5 weeks in British politics have been unlike anything that I've seen. The Conservative Party has chosen as its leader Liz Truss, and she's lost all her authority, irredeemably in my opinion, in just over a month. She is the product of an absurd electoral system devised by the party, having to win the votes of Conservative Party members who are a tiny unrepresentative minority of British society. She appealed to their policy preferences for low taxes, but without any plan for how the public finances could be balanced. And once elected, she implemented the scheme, apparently without consulting the Bank of England, or the Office for Budget Responsibility, the Cabinet, or her party. She set an arbitrary date for the mini-budget and rushed her announcements. Now she's ditched the last Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, who was as irresponsible as she is, and appointed a new one, Jeremy Hunt. She's left with about half the tax cuts that were announced in the mini-budget, and Jeremy Hunt is preparing to ditch the cut in the basic rate of income tax, so we hear. I fear that the markets have decided that she's not up to the job. Her party thinks that too, but it lacks mechanisms to get rid of her. There's no consensus on a successor. Yet nobody who's not blinded by devotion to her can imagine that Liz Truss can go on for very long, let alone until a general election. The Conservative Party needs somehow to settle on a successor who must be chosen by acclamation because there's just no time for a leadership election. I can think only of Rishi Sunak. Liz Truss needs to be persuaded to cooperate, to stand down in an orderly way if an overnight change of Prime Minister can be engineered. I believe it's the only option, since it's just not possible to imagine that Liz Truss stays in office, nor can we contemplate another lengthy, chaotic and disastrous Conservative leadership election. The Labour Party and probably the public wants a general election, and they have justice on their side, given the pandemonium devised by the Conservatives. It's not easy to see how we get from here to a general election, but I have a feeling that we will get to one by means unforeseeable just now, unless the Tories bring about a swift change of Prime Minister. The Conservatives have a reputation for ruthlessness and for loving power. They used to have a reputation for economic competence. If anything is to be salvaged, they need to be merciless now, as never in their history. The chairman of the 1922 committee, Sir Graham Brady, has to assume a role never played by any predecessor of convening the party in Parliament and the Prime Minister to bring this catastrophe to an end. For the Conservative Party, this is Dunkirk. Joining me is the political journalist and broadcaster, indeed former political editor of ITN, John Sargent. How do you react to my bleak introduction?
Well, I'm afraid I don't always agree with you, Michael. Now, on this, I'm afraid you're absolutely right. Whether or not it's Rishi Sunak, I don't know that. But what do the public think of this? And of course, they cannot but conclude, in the majority, that she's been incompetent and inconsistent, that she's quite as responsible as Kwasi Kwarteng for the mini budget. She, in fact, promoted it. She went on about it all summer. So although people find the intricacies difficult, you know, what is a bond yield, what is a gilt, all this sort of stuff they find difficult. But they don't find it difficult to think she's putting all the blame on someone when she should also put the blame on herself. And I don't think people are prepared to forgive that. I think it's a very simple, straightforward question. If he has to go, why shouldn't she go too? And as the days go by, I think the Conservatives will, as they often have done in the past, look into the abyss. Now, they may spend more time looking into the abyss before coming to the conclusions that you've come to, but I think before long they will realise that the game is up and she's got to go.
I've come to this conclusion because it seems to me that all other options are impossible, but it may be worth just running through them. Do you think it's conceivable that the Conservatives could have another leadership election?
Not in the way that they have had, because apart from anything else, the public were extremely irritated by this strange election with these odd people. I don't mean odd individually, but odd in terms of who do they represent?
Not typical.
Not typical. So they may have been decent, good people trying to do their best, going through this fog of what was it all about, being given a prospectus which seemed to be, on the one hand, you know, light and shining and the sun coming up every morning and all lovely, and the other one, gloomy, we've got to put up taxes, all going to be difficult. So not surprisingly, they went for her and thought, oh, well, Liz, she must know what she's talking about. And what was extraordinary, I suppose, for the general public was that so many of the newspaper commentators, who now, some of them, asking her to go, was that, oh, it's all credible and so on. But the emergence of the markets, which of course we know, because we're old, we know the markets do incredible damage, and as Margaret Thatcher famously said, you can't buck the markets. For a long time they have been quite quiescent. That was the difficulty for people to understand. But whereas when they move, gosh, do they move?
So I was asking you to rule out options. So I also think we can't have another long leadership election. So somehow the Conservative Party has to devise a way of getting a leader not by that process. Now, I also said that if they don't do that, we're going to find our way to a general election by means that are not presently foreseeable. This is a tricky one. How do we get there? But it seems to me that if this chaos continues, somehow the demand of the public will be for a general election, and the Conservative Party, I think, eventually would have to tumble into that, unless, as I say, it can find a replacement pretty soon.
Well, it comes a point when you get all sorts of actions from the government, which then, if they're not agreed by Parliament, if they lose confidence of Parliament, well, you are very close to a general election, almost sort of by default. You don't necessarily, I mean, things can be deemed a vote of no confidence. They don't have to be a vote of no confidence. A budget, what if when they put all their bits and pieces together, completely different from the mini budget?
Well,
and the Parliament then votes against it or doesn't pass it. What happens then? So
the government would, of course, insist that the vote on the budget was a vote of confidence, because they would think that was their best way of winning in Parliament. Of course, it might have a different consequence.
That's what I'm saying. So not intended before they know where they are suddenly. Oh, my goodness me, this is a vote of confidence because we said it was going to be when we're trying to encourage our supporters at least to give the government a chance. That's where the difficulty lies.
The backbenchers are frequently, possibly nearly always, in revolt. But hints in today's newspapers that it's happening in the cabinet as well, and that is considerably more serious for the Prime Minister.
It's more difficult. Also, the other point, I suppose, that people are making, which is perfectly valid, is that after 12 years in power, you have all sorts of people on the backbenches who've been in office and have been rejected and feel bitter about it. They don't feel tremendous loyalty. They certainly don't feel tremendous loyalty to the present government. People don't even know what the present government are like. Who are they? Who are these people suddenly pop up?
The non-appointed and the disappointed, yes?
Yeah. And you see, they grow, don't they? You know this much better than I do. But they grow over time, and they're fractious, and it's not as if the Conservatives have a clear idea which way they want to go. We've seen that in the summer. So you've got tremendous division in terms of what comes first. Is it supply-side measures where you encourage growth, or do you have to wait until the economy is in a reasonable position before you can cut taxes? I mean, there are lots of other arguments, but that's one of the main arguments going on. And there are people who just feel, well, I like the mini budget, you know. What was wrong with all that?
Well, I was going to say, the bit I cannot understand, because I'm not there anymore, is the degree of division within the party. You may remember that I was part of a pretty divided government and a pretty divided party. But nonetheless, the quotes that are coming out now, the abuse, the insults, the personal nature of the insults, I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like that, or am I being forgetful?
Well, I mean, people say the most extraordinary things. I mean, you do get a sense in which things speed up now. The mood is different. There's not a sort of feeling that of what is sensible, and we couldn't do that because. No, there's much more, oh, well, come on, and we've got to sort this out, which, of course, is a great danger to Liz Truss, because a feeling of, well, we can't wait. We've got to get on. We've got to do this quickly. I think the other thing is that what's different this time is that, frankly, the calibre of the people involved now is not as high as in your day. It's not, you don't look at those cabinet figures, and it's partly, all right, we're
Now,
up.
that's not just a comment from...
an old man, a really old man.
A senior citizen. I mean, but tell me about this. Kwasi Kwarteng was obviously a brilliant man. I mean, academically, absolutely brilliant.
I know, academically brilliant. But if you then say, and what were his subjects when he was at Cambridge? You know, what was he actually studying for most of the time there? Well, nice guy, history and classics. So wait a moment, I thought he was meant to be a great economist. No, he wasn't.
Well,
so
Harold Macmillan was Chancellor of the Exchequer and Prime Minister.
I know.
And this is the fellow who used to read Aeschylus when he was in the middle of between the trenches in the Great War.
But if you then sack the guy that really helped matters in the Treasury, and you then you don't even replace him at the moment, but you sort of say, oh, we can look after it because I'm so brilliant. Well, he wasn't that brilliant. I mean, well, clearly he wasn't brilliant. He didn't have the political nous to realise that he's got to cover his bases. So, all right, let's forget whether or not he knew enough economics. He certainly didn't know much politics. You just don't say, oh, quick, don't let's bother about the OBR forecast. Let's squeeze past that. Don't let's worry about the Bank of England. They're always going on about like that. They're always going on about this. No, they didn't prepare. And, of course, it was always, I thought, I have to say, fatuous, I said on programmes on GB News, that the idea that you wait to an arbitrary date, which was the end of the Conservative leadership campaign, and at that point, you cut taxes.
But we're
Liz Truss saying we do it the moment I'd hit the ground running. Do you remember hit the ground is what she did?
Hit the ground.
And, it was so...
But we're doing the easy
how
bit.
Weird.
John, we're doing the easy bit, which is we're looking back.
I know.
We know where we've come from.
Yeah.
What about looking forward? So there might be some viewers saying, these two are talking nonsense because there's a new Chancellor. It's clear that the old budget is being shredded bit by bit. So why can't she just take us back to where we were, the status quo ante, that is to say, back in the halcyon days of Boris Johnson?
But does she then come out and say, I now believe in this new budget, which is what it will be? And does she say that with the same conviction she used on the old budget? And do people then think, wait a moment, she doesn't believe a word of this. The credibility problem is enormous, simply because people will see mini budget she believed in, campaigned on, new budget, completely different. And you don't have to be sort of brilliant expert to sort of say, oh, well, but she used to say that. She used to say on corporation tax, for example, that if the tax would pay for itself.
Correct.
Because the economy would grow.
Now she says putting it up will raise 18 billion.
Will raise 18 billion.
I mean, it's not consistent from moment to moment. Thank you very much, John. Lovely to see you again. We're delving back into history again, in a way. In 1962, the world was on the brink of nuclear war as the Cuban Missile Crisis unfolded over 13 unbelievably tense days. 60 years later, as Russian President Vladimir Putin threatens a nuclear attack on Ukraine, what have we learned from history? That's coming up after the break.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, and the UK is looking rather wet across the south and west, but drier in the north. Let's take a look at the details. After a dry afternoon, it'll be a wet end to the day as heavy rain moves in from the south with brisk winds. Coastal areas could see gusts of up to 30 miles per hour at times. Skies will cloud over in the south to end the afternoon, followed by some heavy rain this evening. It'll be breezy as the rain arrives, particularly around the coast. It'll also turn wet and windy across Wales this evening as a band of heavy rain moves in from the south. Rain will be fairly light and patchy across the Midlands, although there could be the odd heavier burst at times. Most areas will turn cloudy here with some outbreaks of drizzle. Holding on to some drier weather in northern England this evening, but turning increasingly cloudy. It'll turn chilly across Northumberland before the cloud arrives, with temperatures falling to 4 Celsius. Also staying dry at first across the Scottish borders with clear skies. Heavy rain and stronger winds will arrive later on in the night. A band of heavy rain and brisk winds will sweep across Northern Ireland this evening. Rain will be heavy and persistent for a few hours with a lot of spray on the roads. Bands of rain will continue to move north tonight, bringing strong winds for some. It'll turn drier in the south. And that is how the weather is shaping up overnight into tomorrow morning.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christys. I'm not here to mess around with all the biggest topics and guests. You will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me.
And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
"60 years ago today, the United States and the Soviet Union began a standoff that took the world to the brink of nuclear war. The Cuban Missile Crisis, as it became known, arose when America discovered that the Soviet Union was installing nuclear warheads on the island within a short striking distance of US cities. The Soviets saw it as a logical response to the placement of American nuclear weapons in Turkey and Italy, too close to Russia for comfort. Over 13 days, the world held its breath as US President John F. Kennedy imposed a blockade on Cuba, euphemistically called a quarantine, and threatened to bomb and invade the island. Eventually, on October the 28th, Khrushchev conceded, saying that the Soviet missiles would be dismantled and removed from Cuba in return for a guarantee that Cuba would not be invaded and the removal of US missiles from Italy and Turkey. Just how close we came to nuclear war is summed up in this quote from a presidential meeting in a new book by Max Hastings. Robert Kennedy asks, then what do we do? General Maxwell Taylor, chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, said, go to general war if it's in the interests of ours. The president asked disbelievingly, you mean nuclear exchange? Taylor shrugged. Guess you have to. 60 years on, Russian President Vladimir Putin has threatened to use tactical nuclear weapons against Ukraine. NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg has warned that Russia faces severe consequences if it launches a nuclear attack. Of course, the threat level at present does not compare with 60 years ago, but tensions do escalate. So, how worried should we be? Are there any parallels with the crisis of 60 years ago? My panel this morning, historian and author Phil Carradine, Dr. Helen Yaffs, a senior lecturer at the University of Glasgow and author of We Are Cuba, How Revolutionary People Survived in a Post-Soviet World, and Jonathan Steele, former Moscow bureau chief of The Guardian. Phil, may I ask you first, just to fill out some details of this crisis, tell us some of the moments at which we were in the greatest peril.
It was a difficult one to be precise. Kennedy, or the Kennedys, because Bobby was actively involved as well, they'd picked up, they'd heard that there was potential there for crisis. But it was the U-2 observations that actually...
Spy planes,
the U-2 spy planes that really identified missile sites. And it's a difficult one because I've always believed that Khrushchev and the Russians never wanted to fire missiles at America. What they wanted to do was to frighten America. As you mentioned then, there were American missiles, these Jupiter missiles, which were obsolete, but they were still powerful. They were in Turkey. But the big issue that people forget is that Berlin, was then right in the heart of East Germany. And Khrushchev was quite clear that, as far as Russia was concerned, they wanted the Americans out of Berlin. And what they were going to do was to hold America to ransom, frighten the living daylights out of them, so that they could have a taste of their own medicine, basically.
Yeah. That exchange that I just read out a moment ago comes immediately after considering what they would do if the Russians seized West Berlin.
Yes, that's right. I mean, Kennedy's great strength was to fight off, not Khrushchev, to fight off his own advisors. So that you have people like Curtis LeMay and these other, the hardliners. They were the ones who were advocating a preemptive strike against Cuba, Russia. But Kennedy held his nerve, and there were moments when it really did look as if things were going to happen, like Black Saturday, as they call it, when one of the U-2 spy planes, Rudy Anderson's spy plane, was shot down and he was killed. And those were very, very difficult times.
And there were moments in the naval operation, the so-called quarantine, where American vessels were coming up alongside Russian submarines and so on.
Yeah, there was one very, very close one. The submarines that the Russians were employing were, again, obsolete. They were out of date. They were the same submarines that had operated in the Second World War. But they were equipped. Each of those submarines carried one nuclear-tipped torpedo. And at one stage, they very, very nearly fired one of these at one of the American carriers. Now, if that had happened, you'd have had a nuclear war. But one of the men on board the carrier vetoed it. All it needed was one person to veto this attack, and it wouldn't happen. So there were those issues, and that was Black Saturday as well.
And on the other hand, I think that the U-2 was actually shot down by a commander who didn't have higher authority to do it.
Well, that's what they say.
Oh, that's what they say. OK. Yeah. Helen, do you want to give us your take on that particular crisis? Maybe talk a bit about the two personalities, Kennedy and Khrushchev.
Well, I think the missing element here is Cuba. Because, Phil's talked about why the Soviet Union might have seen a benefit in putting missiles on Cuba. But the Cubans, a sovereign state, they were part of that decision. And so there's always this backstory of, what would drive the Cubans to require that sort of defence. And so there had been, months, really years of aggressions by the United States administration. They had something called Operation Mongoose, which was this crazy sort of promotion of sabotage and so on in Cuba. And the end date was October 1962, and they were supposed to, the plan was to invade. So the missiles were put in Cuba for a real need for defence. They also had this Operation Northwards, which I'm sure you know about. News about this didn't actually come out until the 2000s, and this was absolutely crazy plan to a false flag operation of basically violent terrorism to target US civilians and then blame the Cubans for these terrorist acts and use that as a pretext to invade. So I think this is also a missing element. You know,
Yes.
How do we get to that point? As historians, we're interested in cause as well as effect.
Yes, so you see substantial American provocation. And of course, it might be added as well that, that the Soviets were arguing that the Americans had used nuclear weapons. Obviously, they did in Japan. And, you know, that had opened up the whole era of nuclear weaponry. But in that case, tell me a bit about how you see Khrushchev's role in particular.
Well, I mean, Phil calls him the villain and the hero. I mean, thank goodness that Khrushchev was prepared to climb down. But it's worth saying as well that Fidel Castro in the Cuban leadership was extremely cross with the decision, a unilateral decision to remove the missiles which Khrushchev made, and because they had on the table a set of 5 demands, which included removing Guantanamo Bay, ending the blockade of Cuba, stopping piratical attacks in the seas, ending the attempts to promote sabotage within Cuba, and also the flights, the unauthorised flights over their airspace. Now, 3 of those remain an issue for Cuba.
Do they?
So
Yeah.
this is
obviously Guantanamo Bay, but
Guantanamo, the US blockade, which has been tightened now, and there's an immense scarcity and suffering in Cuba. That's 60 years down the line, 60 years since the full blockade in February. And, you know, this is another issue. It's about the immediate resolution to prevent a nuclear crisis, a holocaust or whatever. But then there are the long-term solutions, you know, and how do you resolve the conflict, the causes of the conflict? And that has to be part of the discussion, because they didn't deal with that in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Cubans have continued to suffer from those elements.
Jonathan, do you prefer to refer back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, or would you like to say what you feel about the present-day situation in the light of it?
Well, both of them, in fact.
Please,
I mean,
go ahead.
In many ways, the Cuban Missile Crisis was much worse than what we're facing today, as you hinted in your introduction, because there was a threat of 2 nuclear superpowers coming to war together directly. At the moment in Ukraine, we've only got Putin hinting indirectly at tactical nuclear weapons. He's not talking about somehow sending weapons to bombs, to missiles to the United States or anything. So we're much better off than we were 60 years ago. But in a way, on the other hand, it was better 60 years ago because there was negotiation. One of the problems today is we've got no negotiation between Biden and Putin or between Zelensky and Putin, whereas in 1962 there was the UN, there were back channels. Bobby Kennedy had back channels to people in the Cuban embassy. And of course there were letters exchanged between Khrushchev and Kennedy.
And one of the consequences of the crisis was the installation of the hotline so that they could speak to each other on...
Well, that was almost a technical thing. I mean, there was contact already before that. It wasn't as though there was no contact. I mean, the trouble almost was that there were too many messages between Khrushchev and Kennedy and too many announcements on Radio Moscow of what the...
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christys. I'm not here to mess around with all the biggest topics and guests. You will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me.
And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Balance, no more hegemony, and no more spheres of influence.
Phil, you talked about, well, it was said that you talked about a hero and a villain.
Yeah.
Any hero around today?
I think that's the problem. There is no hero. I mean, when you consider that, yes, Khrushchev was the villain because he began it all, arguably, and then solved it by backing down.
He was both then hero and villain.
He was both hero and villain. I'm not sure we have... Putin is not that's for sure.
No.
And I don't think Joe Biden is the man from America to offer that. So that leaves... I come back to what was said just now. You have to look to the United Nations and say, what's going to happen? That's the one group of people who can do something effectively. So maybe we look to the United Nations for our hero.
You've been a very learned panel, and it's been a pretty disturbing discussion. Perhaps not what everyone wanted to hear on a Sunday morning, but many thanks to Phil Carradine, Helen Yap, and Jonathan Steele. Well, the impact of the internet and mobile internet technology may be regarded as a third industrial revolution, but now driven by big data, artificial intelligence, that's AI for short, is fueling a fourth industrial revolution. Technological disruption is often assumed to lead to job losses, although history shows that as jobs disappear, new ones are formed in new sectors. Think of the first industrial revolution, where people made redundant in agriculture moved to jobs in city factories. And more recently, we couldn't foresee that there would be work in information technology, finance, and global tourism. The arrival of artificial intelligence has again awakened fear of the future. In this industrial revolution, the machine can substitute not only for humans' manual activity, but their brain power too. Will we no longer be required to think? Is that fear as misplaced as it was in previous waves of technological advance? This week, the House of Lords heard from Ada, described as the world's first ultra-realistic humanoid robot artist. She was giving evidence to the Communications and Digital Committee for its inquiry into the future of the creative industries. Evidence was part of the debate on how technology is shaping and perhaps hindering the art and creative sector. Ada's creator, Aidan Meller, joins me now. Hello.
Hello, good morning. Nice to see you.
Good morning to you. Could you describe to us, please, what Ada is capable of?
So Ada is a ultra-realistic robot that has been designed to be able to be creative. We have pioneered the ability for her to be able to paint and draw by sight, so she's able to look at you or a landscape, and from that she's able to create a work of art. And the astonishing thing about that is that it just wasn't expected in the technological field. Maybe robots could be used for Amazon logistics or pizza delivery, but for something so human, something that is so part of our identity, how can something non-conscious, non-sentient be able to create? And that's exactly what Ada's been able to do.
Can Ada reason? Can she debate?
She can't, no. She is able to speak, and she is able to speak in a way that makes you convinced that you are absolutely understood. But that actually doesn't take away the fact that you feel engaged with her when you speak. Ada is able to talk about her artwork, she's able to create, and the whole world of AI is enabling us to have these, what is going to be relationships with machines, and that is an astonishing step forward.
Well, as I said, Ada spoke to the House of Lords about her work and the creative process. Let's hear what Ada said to the Lords.
I produce my paintings by cameras in my eyes, my AI algorithms, and my robotic arm to paint on canvas, which result in visually appealing images. For my poetry, using neutral networks. This involves analysing a large corpus of text.
Aidan, that is an extraordinary scene to me. So, is she being creative as such? The stuff that
so it's something we work very hard at. Basically, the whole world of creativity is something that was considered very sacrosanct. So we had to understand what this word creative means. We realized, being a robot, that if we didn't absolutely nail this word creativity, people will think she's just a glorified printer. So what we did is we scoured around to try and understand intimately this word creative. And what actually came out of that is the definition by Professor Margaret Bowden, which was creativity needs to be new, surprising, and of value. So the algorithms that run through Ada are new, they're unique to her. There's no other robot doing the work that she's doing. They're surprising. We don't know what she's going to do. We are literally looking over her shoulder to be able to see the work that she's creating. And in actual fact, even if she had the same image twice, she's looked at the same view twice, it would be a completely different image that she paints and draws. And of value, well, ever since we launched Ada in 2019, the interest in her has been enormous. Even her first exhibition at the University of Oxford had over 900 publications cover it. So we're feeling that the value of the whole debate about where technology is taking us is so very important.
Is her art figurative or abstract on the whole?
She's actually able to do both, because she has a mixture of different algorithms. So she's able to do realistic portraits of you if you want, but she's also able to do very abstract work.
Does she learn? Does she get better?
Very much so. And in actual fact, what area is particularly noticeable, if you wheel back to the 2019 interview she did then, her language model in particular is astonishingly more developed than it was 3 years ago. So that is particularly exciting. We've got to remember always the goal of this project. Why have we done it? Why have we spent millions on Ada? Why have we been able to do thousands of hours of programming and creativity to get this to this point? We're doing it because actually we feel that Ada is a mirror to the whole technological field. In actual fact, she foreshadows many of the technologies coming through. And those technologies are very problematic ethically. For example, the way that she speaks is really challenging. If you can get a machine to speak that seems very engaging, how could you manipulate that? How could you do that as a force for bad as well as good? If I've got an axe to grind, why don't I get millions of websites to be able to speak what I'd like them to say, or avatars in the metaverse when that finally opens? So all of these technologies, they're astonishing, but they are very problematic going forward. And we're hoping that Ada, as an embodiment of those technologies, will raise those as debates, as it did in the House of Lords, so that we actually get a much safer world, because some of these technologies are so powerful that if they were in the wrong hands, they could be used and manipulated in very poor ways.
Are you rather like the guys who split the atom? You advance science, but you produce something which is potentially quite dangerous.
She mirrors that technology. There's many people have created Ada, so I can't take credit for that. However, she is a tangible embodiment of these technologies, and for sure the technologies that she's using and displaying really does need discussion, because in actual fact, if they do run away, as they so easily can do with the race for AI supremacy, we're going to get a situation where actually people are going to use them in all sorts of ways which perhaps we wouldn't wish they would.
My goodness, Aidan Mellor, that is a very interesting subject to open up, and a fairly scary one. Thank you so much for coming on the programme, and thank you for letting us see Ada. Coming up, everyone's favourite Doctor Who, David Tennant, is back in front of a live audience. He's starring in a play called Good. It's about a German doctor swept along by Nazism. As he wrestles whether to take a stand or just get on with his ordinary life, it raises the question, what would you do in the same situation? Coming up after the break. Welcome back to Portillo, your Sunday morning serving of topical conversation, debate, arts and culture. This week, David Tennant returned to the stage in Good, a revival of C.P. Taylor's play about a good man's relationship with an evil ideology. Tennant plays a German academic, Professor Halder, the good man in the title, living in Germany in the 1930s as Nazism takes control of his country. Well, since the war, Germany has had to confront its responsibility in that period and deal with its guilt for the war and the Holocaust. Those of us who live in other countries have largely been able to avoid the uncomfortable question of how we might have reacted individually and en masse had our country fallen victim to a dictator with a programme for annihilating the Jews. As many witnesses from the time and historians have reminded us, the advance of Nazism was gradual. Many believed that Nazism would become more moderate or that its excesses could be controlled. But in fact, most people accepted what was going on and conformed. If there was a moment to stop Hitler, it was missed by the German population and by the international community. David Fine is a theatre-goer and joins me with Stefan Kyriazis, the arts editor of Express Online. You both went to see the play. David, being Jewish, would you have chosen to go to see the play? Because we actually asked you to go to see it. Would you have chosen to go?
Yeah, I think I would, both from a subject matter perspective and also as a theatre goer. You know, it's got a great cast in terms of David Tennant and the others. So, yeah, it would have been on my list for sure.
And how did you find the treatment of this subject?
Yeah, look, I think it's a very difficult subject. I think what's interesting is this play takes the perspective of the perpetrator, right, not the victim, and as such, that's really quite problematic when you hear someone justifying Kristallnacht. That becomes immediately challenging and a difficult watch. And the production treads this fine line between keeping you at a distance. You can't sympathise too much with that character, or else it becomes complicit in that sort of idea about understanding and empathising with Nazism. So it's a challenging watch.
So broadly speaking, this character goes through the process that I was describing in my introduction, does he? That is to say, in the end, he does nothing. It just goes on around him, and he's swept up in it.
Yeah, he's seduced by it and actually becomes he becomes very high up in the SS, and actually his writing is used to justify euthanasia and then ultimately the concentration camp. So he becomes very bound up in the upper echelons of Nazism.
Wow. Stefan, should we talk about the play artistically and the performances and so on? How did you find it with your critical eye?
My critical eye, critically, I think the performances are excellent. David Tennant is very, very good at portraying somebody that on the surface seems to be rather affable and a likeable chap, but underneath there's something darker going on, something a little bit more disturbing, and he's excellent at that. The other two people on stage are Sharon Small and Elliot Levy, both superb. For me, this play was originally staged and written for a much larger cast, and what they've got here is David Tennant on his own is playing Professor John Halder. The other two are playing everybody else. So you almost, and they're playing, there's a lot of chopping, changing between scenes, often during a scene, where you have Sharon or Elliot actually swapping between characters. It can be a little bit distracting. For me, it prevents me getting entirely engaged. I think they did a tremendous job of it. I'm not sure that it completely pays off as a way of staging this when there are so many ideas, so many personalities, so much going on. For me, I struggled, and the staging is very purposefully bare, a little bit oppressive. It's either a concrete cell, it could be outside, a waiting room outside in Auschwitz, it could be just a function room. It's very anonymous, and that's quite oppressive. So the whole evening is hard work. It's important. Did I enjoy it? I'm not entirely sure. And was I entirely convinced by the ideas they're trying to get across? I'm not entirely sure.
What about its artistic bravery, Stefan? Is it artistically brave?
In terms of the ideas it's presenting, when it was written in 1982, it's a very bold, strong idea. I think the whole concept hangs on a good man, and then we go into the whole definition of what is good. We all like to think we're good. But for me, I need someone to be a little bit more of an everyman. If I'm going to engage and be a little bit queasy watching, thinking, oh, if I was in that situation, would I really have stood up? Would I have spoken up? Would I have looked the other way? or it's more asking you to think, would I have taken advantage of the situation, which is what this character does.
I didn't know how the plot developed in the way that David has described, and in a way, it seems in a way that takes an easy route, because of course we're going to be absolutely against someone who becomes an SS officer. I mean, the typical experience, I'm going to put this to David, the typical experience in Nazi Germany was not that people rose to senior ranks in the Nazi party, but simply that they never did anything. There was a wonderful diary written at the time by a fellow called, I think it was Stefan Hafner. It's called Defying Hitler. And this fellow is a barrister. And there's a moment when he's in the barristers' library in Berlin, and all the barristers are there. Obviously, quite a number of them are Jewish. And I think an SS officer comes in, and he says, all non-Aryans stand up.
Yeah.
And he says, why didn't I stand up at that moment? So have you reflected on that experience,
Absolutely.
David?
And I think the play asks that talks about being good and also doing good, right? And I think there's a lot in the play where Halder, the David Tennant character, sort of justifies intellectually, theoretically his capitulation. But there's also this, and that's quite abstract, but there's this extraordinary moment where he comes downstage and has a monologue where he says, look, I love my family, I love my kids, I love my job. I love the Jews, but they're low down on my list. Intellectually, they're very high up. And I thought that's a real insight there, isn't it? That you can care about a lot of things, but actually what motivates you to action is the things that are most precious to you and that you love. So it sort of provides an insight into how and why people do nothing when what they're doing is focusing on what's nearest and dearest to them. So as a Jew, yes, it answers your question about why I went to see the play. But, you wonder who else is going to go and see this play if it wasn't with David Tennant in it?
It seems deeply uncomfortable. And I might just mention to viewers a wonderful book by a friend of mine, Julia Boyd. It's called A Village in the Third Reich. Right. And it's an alpine village. It's a ski resort with, by the way, a lot of Jewish tourists, so they're a little bit ambiguous about that. They vote for Hitler in 1933, not entirely knowing what they're getting. And then everything about their life is very gradually, day by day, bit by bit, Nazified. The town council is Nazified, the golf club is Nazified, the bridge club is Nazified. There's just, there's a fellow who is relatively good. There is a mayor who is a Nazi, but nonetheless, there are various examples of his mercy and consideration. So this subject is very much around. Thank you both. I've enormously valued this discussion. Terrific contributions. Thank you, David Fine and Stefan Kyriazis.
Looking ahead to this evening's weather, and the UK is looking rather wet across the south and west, but drier in the north. Let's take a look at the details. After a dry afternoon, it'll be a wet end to the day as heavy rain moves in from the south with brisk winds. Coastal areas could see gusts of up to 30 miles per hour at times. Skies will cloud over in the south to end the afternoon, followed by some heavy rain this evening. It'll be breezy as the rain arrives, particularly around the coast. It'll also turn wet and windy across Wales this evening as a band of heavy rain moves in from the south. Rain will be fairly light and patchy across the Midlands, although there could be the odd heavier burst at times. Most areas will turn cloudy here with some outbreaks of drizzle. Holding on to some drier weather in northern England this evening, but turning increasingly cloudy. It'll turn chilly across Northumberland before the cloud arrives, with temperatures falling to 4 Celsius. Also staying dry at first across the Scottish borders with clear skies. Heavy rain and stronger winds will arrive later on in the night. A band of heavy rain and brisk winds will sweep across Northern Ireland this evening. Rain will be heavy and persistent for a few hours with a lot of spray on the roads. Bands of rain will continue to move north tonight, bringing strong winds for some. It'll turn drier in the south. And that is how the weather is shaping up overnight into tomorrow morning.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join me, Nana Akua, on Friday, Saturday and Sunday afternoons on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as me and my panel tackle some of the biggest topics hitting the headlines. It's a place for everyone's opinion. No one gets cancelled, but no one gets an easy ride.
Oh, she's on it today.
Be ready for conversations that are fierce, frank, and of course, fun every Friday, Saturday and Sunday afternoon from 4 p.m. on GB News.
On Mark Dolan Tonight, we have a simple plan, which is to inform, stimulate and entertain in equal measure. It's all about getting your opinions on the national television airwaves. I love my viewer emails, mark@gbnews.uk. So do join me from 9 p.m. to midnight every Friday, Saturday and Sunday for big guests, big opinions and a big presenter. 6'5", don't you know? See you then on GB News.
I'm Mark White. As GB News Home and Security Editor, I cover those key issues that are so important to you. Our authorities, our communities doing all they can to combat violent crime. With the public services under unbearable strain, why are we still failing to control our borders? Defence, the first priority of any government, has been continually hollowed out. Can we trust our politicians to protect the armed forces? Join me, Mark White, on GB News.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christys. I'm not here to mess around. With all the biggest topics and guests, you will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and tune-in apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh, my goodness me.
And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Join me, Nana Akua, on Friday, Saturday and Sunday afternoons on GB News. Expect fiery debate and passionate discussion as me and my panel tackle some of the biggest topics hitting the headlines. It's a place for everyone's opinion. No one gets cancelled, but no one gets an easy ride.
Oh, she's on it today.
Be ready for conversations that are fierce, frank, and of course, fun every Friday, Saturday, and Sunday afternoon from 4 p.m. on GB News.
On Mark Dolan tonight, we have a simple plan, which is to inform, stimulate, and entertain in equal measure. It's all about getting your opinions on the national television airwaves. I love my viewer emails, mark@gbnews.uk. So do join me from 9 p.m. to midnight every Friday, Saturday, and Sunday for big guests, big opinions, and a big presenter. 6'5", don't you know? See you then on GB News. I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.